Welcome everyone to our workshop, Afrocentric Governance, part of the Small Black-led and Racialized Organization online workshop series. This is our 7th and final workshop within this project. My name is Adel Marab, and please note this session is being recorded and will be available on the project webpage early next week. The presentation today and the additional tools resources are available for download on the project webpage, which link will be posted in a moment in the chat box. First, we would like to mention a few housekeeping, engagement, and self-care points for this session. OCASI is committed to supporting full participation and engagement by all attendees at our events, including people with disabilities. This session is facilitated in English, French simultaneous interpretation, American Sign Language ASL, Quebec Sign Language LSQ, and English captioning are available. If you wish to enable the French simultaneous interpretation, you can go down in your Zoom screen to your meeting control toolbar, click on the interpretation icon, and then click on French. If you wish to enable the ASL or the LSQ feature, as well as in your meeting control toolbar, click on the interpretation icon, and under Watch, you can click on ASL for American Sign Language or FSL, French Sign Language, for the LSQ. If you wish to enable the closed caption feature in your meeting control toolbar, click on Show Caption icon represented with CC. Zoom fatigue is real, so do what you need to do to take care of you first. Stay present and be attentive to your body and your emotions. Please keep yourself muted throughout the session until we reach the question and answer section. If you have any technical questions, please use the chat feature to communicate directly with @OCASI chatbox support. And finally, please fill out the evaluation form that will be shared at the end of the session to help us improve our future workshops. The moment you leave this meeting, it will automatically open on your browser. Please do take a minute or two to fill in this very short survey. And now I would like to introduce to you our facilitators trainer for today, Liben Gebremikael, Chief Executive Officer at TAIBU Community Health Center.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation engagement. I'm looking forward to our engagement today. I think some of you may have participated in the previous session with the Governance 101 session, and we had touched upon some of the areas that we will be talking today. And so I'm very, very privileged and grateful that I'm here with you to speak about Afrocentric governance. I'm gonna share my screen so I can start the conversation, and then we'll take it from there. I'm sure there's going to be quite a lot of hopefully some questions to be entertained. I like questions, I like conversation, but I'll try to go through the prepared slides initially, and then hopefully leave some time for conversation and questions, and for people to also add to the concept that we're going to be sharing today. As always, we would like to start with land acknowledgement. TAIBU operates from the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. and most recently the Mississaugas of the Great River First Nations. But today I'm joining you from Ottawa, and Ottawa is placed and ceded on unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. And I'm also affirming the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous people across the land. And as an organization, we also adhere to the principle of Indigenous health and Indigenous science, and that's how we are supporting Indigenous communities in Scarborough. Thank you for that brief reflection. And also, I would like to acknowledge people who have come before me as a person of African origin and descent. And as you all know, we are in the month of February, the busiest time for people of African descent. The reason why I'm in Ottawa is to participate in the celebration of Black History Month here in the capital city. And this year's theme for the Black History Month is Black Excellence, a heritage to celebrate and a future to build. We all know that Black history is not just celebrated or reflected upon just once, 1 month a year. But I think it gives us an opportunity to pause and to reflect on the struggles, the challenges, the barriers, the atrocities that people of African descent have gone through, and also for all the contributions that they have made to society overall, but to the Canadian context as well. And the reason why, for example, I'm here before you with privilege to come and talk to you is because of what people who have come before us have been able to achieve for us. And if you didn't know, if you didn't hear, we are under the United Nations decade for people of African descent. And it was, the decade was from 2015 to 2024 this year. But yesterday at the Black History Month celebration, the Prime Minister has made an announcement to say that the decade, at least in Canada, has been extended to 2028, which is a good thing. Number one, I think the Canadian government had to catch up on things because it only acknowledged or recognized the decade in 2018. I think it was the first time that the Canadian government recognized the decade. So I think there is a lot of work to be done, and hopefully there's going to be a plan attached to this extension of the decade in Canada. But I thought it was a significant announcement, so that's very good. Okay, now I think we can go into our conversation. A little bit about TAIBU for those people who have not been in our session last time, and so just so you know the context of where I'm coming from, why this session is going to be very important. So TAIBU was established about 2008 with the mandate to serve the Black population across the Greater Toronto area and advance and improve Black health. Because as you all know, there are several disproportionalities, disparities, and inequities impacting the health and well-being of Black Canadians. And so the sponsoring organization, the Black Health Alliance, had this vision of creating a center that is dedicated on the issues of Black health, and that's what TAIBU was established for with that mission. And then, with a vision to really achieve and maintain health for Black communities through community development, knowledge exchange, empowerment, and working towards the elimination of systemic racism. And we have, certain values that we use that guides the philosophy of the organization in terms of its service delivery, its engagement with communities, its engagement with other stakeholders, and Black leadership is key for us. All that we do is driven by the community, for the community. Afrocentricity, which is some of the things that we're going to be talking about, is central to what we do and how we do things. And quality and addressing equity are the values that the board of directors has set for the organization. We are an accredited organization, accredited by the Canadian Center of Accreditation, and over the years have demonstrated some good work, some groundbreaking work, some leadership work in various areas, whether it is primary healthcare, whether it is COVID-19, and most recently with our Toronto Community Crisis Response in Toronto, where we are leading the establishment and implementation of a non-police, community-based and community-led mental health and social crisis response service in the region of Scarborough. Where did this governance capacity building work start with TAIBU? Just as a context, is came out of the recommendations from the City of Toronto, the Toronto Action Plan for Confronting Anti-Black Racism. Just to mention that, you know, as far as we know, Toronto is the only municipality that has an action plan to confront anti-Black racism. So that's significant for us. And as part of the one of the recommendations of the action plan was to increase the representation of Black members of the Black community onto boards of health and social services space, which is, I think, is very critical, because we know there is significant underrepresentation of Black people on board and governance spaces and leadership spaces, where a lot of decisions are made for several communities, including Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. So that was critical. In our approach to that idea or request for proposal, we submitted two other components. We said it's very easy to train Black people and match them to board opportunities. That's great. But there are two areas that are significant. One area is there are a lot of small grassroots community organizations that don't have the capacity and do not thrive or sustain themselves because of governance, lack of governance capacity. And we said we want to develop a model to support a small grassroots community organization, which is part of what we're doing today, and very pleased to be there to participate in that capacity building work. But most importantly, we also said that to put Black people on certain boards could be dangerous and could be toxic for people, because the governance space has not really looked at itself to adjust to how they will receive not just the bodies of Black people, but the voices of Black people if they have not done some work. And so that's how this Black Governance and Leadership Project came to be, and we've been doing this work for quite some time now. And some of the conversations as we go through this, you will see what I mean by that. So we want to talk a little bit about board functions, just like what we did last time, and connect it to how it's going to be an African-centered kind of governance and leadership space. We'll talk about, why do we need an Afrocentric governance view or perspective or guiding principles? Because I think that would be our foundation to say, this is the case, then we really need to do an African-centered governance and leadership model. And then talk about what do we mean by Afrocentricity and get those terminologies a little bit defined. And then we'll talk about the governance models that we think, but also you can add to your own kind of context and perspective. All right. So let's go and refresh ourselves to say what is the overall very high level responsibilities of board of directors or governance spaces. If you were part of the Governance 101 session last 2 weeks, you would have seen that there are three main roles and responsibilities of boards, broadly speaking. These are called fiduciary roles, strategic roles and responsibilities, and generative roles and responsibilities. And fiduciary roles and responsibilities usually look inside the organization, and it's the duties and responsibilities to oversee the management and operations of the organization, governance, management, and operations of the organization. So it's looking at are we in conformity with what we said that we were going to do? Are we, complying to certain legal and other responsibilities and requirements that we have? How is the organization functioning? Are we spending our monies according to our budget? Are there any risk issues? Are our staff and human resources treated according to legislation and also our policies? So it's looking at how organizations are doing the work that they're supposed to do, and that is the role of the board. um, and in our conversation last time, we have said that many times, especially with small grassroots Black-led organizations, because of the capacity that they are mostly, working boards or in transition from a working board to a governing or a policy board. And I'm also being mindful of that, right? But still, whether you are a working board or a policy governing board, you have an oversight responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility of looking internally into how the board functions, into how the operation functions. The second board responsibility is the strategic board responsibilities and functions. And that is foresight or looking ahead and saying, where are we going and how are we going to get there? So that involves the development of a strategic plan, certain priorities for the next 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. And then based on that long-term high-level plan, developing an operational plan to say, and this is how we're going to get there. If in 3 years we want this organization to get to X, Y, and Z, it is how we're going to get there through our operational plan. And then from there, you will create a fiduciary responsibility by having a monitoring and reporting requirement and system in place. So these two fiduciary and strategic responsibilities look internally to look at what the organization is doing and looking ahead in what the organization is supposed to do and where it's going. But there is another function called the generative function. And this kind of function and discussion is quite recent in the last 20, 25 years, where this kind of moving away from micromanaging organization to really making sense of organizations and keeping the organizations alive. And this is more about insight and asking questions about why, right? And making sense. And why are we doing this today? And why is our mandate like this today? And re-engaging, re-energizing the mandate, the purpose of the organization, but also trying to make sense of how we're going to be solving problems. And this is very important because if the fiduciary and strategic responsibilities of the board could be figured out as the hardware of a computer, you need the software to make things move ahead. Just like on your computer, you just have your updates on a regular basis. Otherwise, you get problems. The generative conversation brings life to the organizations and move forward. And so in our engagement with different organizations, we say it's good to have fiduciary control and looking at what you're doing. It's good to have a plan, but it's also good to keep the organization alive. So this is a very broad discussion around the roles of boards and governance as leadership. And now that will help us to, when we're thinking about Afrocentric views, that's where we will see where this component is going to come in. It's going to come into the generative conversations of how we do things and why we do it this way and why this is going to be important. And those values and principles and guidance and traditions are going to make this organization function the way it should function. It would also have, fiduciary and strategic kind of insertion into that governance process, but it will keep the organization moving in the way that it should move. And it's very, very important, particularly for Black-led organizations serving Black communities, that we have this concept in our conversation, in our planning, in our framework, in our policies. And I'll explain. So the explanation comes from the concept of, inequities, disparities, but essentially marginalization. That's where this is rooted in. And what do I mean by marginalization? I mean by marginalization that there is a society that has its norm and cultures, it has its social structures, it has its service structures. There is, education and methods of knowing. There is the health and well-being, and what do we mean by health and how health is defined. And most importantly, there is also a sense of belongingness and civic participation. These are kind of some elements of a society, right? And we know in the context that we find ourselves, the European society, the Eurocentric society, the American society, the North American society, the Canadian society, has this defined norms and cultures and belongingness and civic structures and service structures that are meant to serve a particular people, community, nation, right? And we all know when we talk about Eurocentric ways of thinking, Eurocentric ways of doing things, it's how this Eurocentric society has been created for. We know that it was never created for certain communities, that are on the margins, right? We're talking about Black communities, indigenous communities, racialized communities, newcomer communities in our immediate context. The society with all those norms and functions and health systems and schooling, education, knowledge was never created with these communities that are in the margins in mind. It was created with a certain views, perspective, knowledge, belief about civilization and stuff like that. And so this is where we find ourselves. We're always on the margin. And so nowadays we're talking about, equity, diversity, inclusion, a word I really don't like, the word inclusion, because for me, when I hear the word inclusion, even though it is a buzzword, I ask question and I say, who is including who, and in which space are being included into, right? Very, very, very broadly, when we see these things that are positive in their approach, that we should be inclusive of all people. Sometimes we think about inclusion as saying, okay, we're going to open up opportunities, we're going to open up some doors, we're going to open up some windows, and we let people into the space, the center of what we're talking. And so there will be some, workshops and training and certain opportunities to increase the number of representation of people in certain areas where there's underrepresentation. And that's what we're trying to do. But the challenge is, when we said that, these norms was never created for these communities in mind, and has not taken their values and their history and what they do and how they live, all those kind of things, just opening some doors and windows and asking people to come into the space is not going to be a good way of inclusion, right? The inclusion has to incorporate some kind of a change within the circle. So that's why, for example, as I said to you earlier on, when we were talking about the Black Governance and Leadership Project, we said it's very easy to bring Black people into a board, right? Do some training and bring them into the board space. And, we have our boxes to say we have 3 members from this group or 2 members from this group. We're good, we're represented or representative. But the way the board functions, the power dynamics, the understanding of anti-Black racism and indigenous specific racism, or other intersectionalities such as to LGBTQ and newcomers and francophone, all those kind of things, if that has not been addressed in such a way in the circle, There may be some people in the circle, but they are not meaningfully and truly included in that, because nothing has changed. We just added a few people into the circle. So this is where this Afrocentric ways of thinking, Afrocentric ways of doing, Afrocentric ways of knowing and self-identity is going to be critical, because if that is not incorporated, it's not going to be meaningful and true for people of African descent coming into the space. And that's what the Afrocentricity means. It's that the perspective, history, culture, knowledge, values of people of African descent is also at the center, And that's what essentially Afrocentricity means. And there are a few definitions here. Systemically displace European ways of thinking, being, feeling, and consciously replace them with ways that are germane to our African culture and experience. We need to introduce these new ways of knowing and identity and culture. Another one maybe is a manner of thought and action in which the centrality in Africanism, interest, values, and perspectives dominate. It does not necessarily mean that we do away with other ways of thinking and perspective and knowledge and culture. It only means significantly that when it comes to issues of people of African descent, their values of and identity and culture and knowledge of people of African descent has to be the perspective that makes planning possible, that makes decision possible, that makes programming possible, because it's going to stay true to who we are as people of African descent. I'll show you a couple of videos moving forward. But just like we were talking about marginalization, the person who's coined this concept of Afrocentricity, Asante, says that we need to move from being spectators of what is happening about us to agents of what is happening about that. That's the kind of the core essence of what Afrocentricity means. And let me see if the video is going to work. You would let me know if maybe I should stop and start sharing, because sometimes the audio does not come on. So let me see if I can do that again. Yeah, and let's see if it's going to work. But people, you can show me some hands and stuff if the voice doesn't come on.
Absolutely. We can try just the first few seconds to make sure that all is working well.
So the question of Afrocentricity is actually an intellectual question, and it's a practical question. It's an intellectual question because it deals with a philosophical orientation.
To pause for a moment. The audio is a bit disconnecting and the visual is not showing. Maybe it is possible to show it on YouTube.
Okay.
If that's
yeah,
okay.
I will do that. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And maybe, I don't know if it's also, but the internet connection seems to be okay. But let me see. Do we see the screen is much better now?
Yes, we see the YouTube channel.
Okay.
The question of Afrocentricity is actually an intellectual question, and it's a practical question. It's an intellectual question because it deals with a philosophical orientation to African people in Africa, in the Caribbean, and in the Americas, in a way that until Afrocentricity came into being as a theoretical construct, it was always hit and miss. In other words, there were some people who were doing work and research, and they were looking at ideas, sometimes from the standpoint of African people, but often from the standpoint of European people looking at African people. So In the 1970s, in the late 1970s, it occurred to me, this time I was head of the Department of Communication at the State University of New York in Buffalo, and it occurred to me that the way we were looking at our own situation as African people, we were looking at that situation as if we were marginal to Europe. In other words, we were on the periphery of Europe. It's interesting that two of the famous African-American historians of a couple of decades earlier had written a book which was called American
The
History
Negro in Our History.
and the Negro Too. And I always thought that that was interesting, that these two black historians, considered at the time among the best of our historians, would write a book in which they would see us as marginal. So Afrocentricity sees itself, or rather, or came into being, I should say, as a view that said that African people were subjects of human history, that we were at the very beginning of human history, and that if you examine any detail of African life, you must see the African as an agent, as an actor, not merely as the acted upon. And I understand what the problem was. The problem was because during the enslavement of Africans, in the U.S., 246 years, and during the enslavement of Africans longer than that in Brazil and in Jamaica, for example, you had this idea that we were only important because of Europe, and that there was nothing that African people did that was a subject position. We were always objects, we were always victims. And it's the rejection of the notion of negation of African people that constituted the very origins of Afrocentricity. The idea behind Afrocentricity was that it was an intellectual idea in which African people viewed themselves, and we insist must be viewed as actors, as subjects, as central to our own historical phenomena. And if we are central to our own historical phenomena, if we are indeed players and actors and participants, then what we say, what we do matters. There's an interesting expression from the 1960s that Maulana Karenga, one of the great philosophers of our era, once expressed, and that was that after he had given a speech and people asked, why do you say what you said? He said, I said what I said, and we express this and we do this because we say so. And this whole notion of what do we say was a notion that for many years had really agitated me. It was like, okay, we know what the Europeans say. We may even know something about what some Asians say, but we don't know what Africans say. What do Africans believe? What will Africans die for? What will Africans live for? What have Africans ever thought about anything? Science, humanities, art, aesthetics, philosophy. And these were the questions that really, I think, spurred and sparked the energy of the 1970s and 80s and 90s, in which African people decided that, you know what, we are no longer going to view ourselves as on the periphery of Europe. We're going to investigate our own historical experiences, and there's nothing greater for us than our own historical experiences. We're going to interrogate our own intellectuals. We're going to interrogate our own spiritual and religious traditions. We're going to interrogate our political contributions to the world. And we're going to ask the question, where did philosophy come from in the first place? We're not junior brothers or junior sisters to the world. And in 1980, when I wrote the book, Afrocentricity, the Theory of Social Change, it was precisely because this was the thing that activated my own mind, was how is it possible that we could have so many millions of African people living in the Americas and the Caribbean, living on the continent of Africa, and we never asked the question, what is in our best interest? What can we add or contribute to this? How do we come back on the stage of human history and take our place once again, as we had once taken our place on the basis of humanity? How can we now do this and contribute again to the world? These were questions. And in Afrocentricity, the theory of social change, I articulated a position that said that if we look at all of our examples in the American context, because that was what I knew at that time, whether you look at the Nation of Islam, whether you look at the Marxists, the Hebrew Israelites, whether you look at Qaeda, whatever you looked at, the Civil Rights Movement, all people tended to have the same analysis of what our situation was. And the answers, the solutions were different, but the analysis was the same. That basically African people had been decentered, dislocated, and moved off of our own terms. We were not just moved off of our terms physically. It's not just that we were moved from Africa to the Americas. It's more than that. If it were only that, then in Africa we would find people who would automatically be Afrocentric. But we discovered that in Africa you also would have people who do not have an Afrocentric consciousness. So what we decided then was that it was possible for people to have Africanity, that is, to wear African clothes, to have African cooking, even to use an African language, and yet be Eurocentric in their orientation, in their consciousness. And so what we decided, and what I decided in writing Afrocentricity, was that I would write Afrocentricity as a lover's book. This was the book written as a lover to African people. That this is the way we change our situation. This is the way we transform our situation. If somebody asks a question about beauty, about goodness, about health, about religion, about art, then the very first thing we have to do is to interrogate our own historical experiences, because they are just as valuable and just as important as any historical experiences in the world. So Afrocentricity was that kind of book. Now the name Afrocentricity was not mine. It didn't come from me. That name Afrocentricity is something that emerged out of the work of Kwame Nkrumah. He was the first one that I have read about, because in the 1960s he had called for, at the University of Ghana, Liben, he had called for an Afrocentric educational experience. And so it was out of that that a number of other people start using the term. But what I tried to do was to give the term substance and a theoretical idea and a basis for us to use it as a guide or as a critical tool for analysis. And that's why Afrocentricity has been such a powerful concept. And I think that perhaps alongside negritude, Afrocentricity is the most widespread intellectual idea that's derived from African people in the 20th century. And I say negritude as widespread, and I realize that there have been many people who have problematized negritude. But Afrocentricity itself, you find that many of the works of some of the leading African thinkers have been described as Afrocentric, even though some of these people have never said that they were Afrocentrics. But Cheikh Anta Diop, for example, may have done some work that was Afrocentric, but he was essentially one of our greatest historians and anthropologists. So I always tell people, I knew Cheikh Anta Diop. I met Cheikh Anta Diop. And Cheikh Anta Diop never said that he was an Afrocentrist, and yet much of his work is Afrocentric. And I think that part of the reason that people didn't necessarily say it was because the terminology was not in existence.
My apologies. There might be a bit of internet connection. Just gonna take us a moment and we'll be back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Oh, okay. I was on mute when I was talking to myself. It was not, but I don't know why my camera is not on. Okay, it's working now. Yeah, I just stopped it there just so that, you know, we can have some more conversation and being mindful of time. And so you would have seen the concept of where this Afrocentricity is coming from. Why is it important? I think you know, Molefe Asante's passion is quite visible there. So I think we will continue with our conversation, and then yeah. So hope that you can see the slides. Okay. If not, I'm sure I'll get a notice to say. So this is where the concept is. Now we know in our structure, in the work that we do, in who we are as Black people in the Canadian context, in the Eurocentric context, we seem to be at the margins of many things, and we have to work towards coming and making sure that we occupy spaces at the center. And part of the work that we do in the settlement work, and now hopefully with the funding that you know we will all receive, thanks to the support of OCASI, this is what is going to be essential. But as an organization, that is also going to be very important in how we do this for our own communities, based on our communities' values and perspective, and how can we put ourselves at the center of our space and be an agent of change and bringing wellness and well-being into our communities. And so when we're talking about Afrocentricity, we have to take into consideration also that the Black community is very rich and diverse. And I know, you know, this is one of the things that we're also getting into conversation, discussion with many people, is that when we're talking about some of the principles and values and knowledge that is being generated around Afrocentricity might be skewed because it's coming out of the, you know, United States and the academic circle over there. But we can consider it from a very rich and diverse perspective because we all have certain values and principles and history and knowledge that we all can bring based on our own immediate context. But we know the experience of all of us as Black people in the Canadian context is the same. There's a common experience that is impacted by anti-Black racism and marginalization and disparities and stuff. All those and the impact of it is common for all of us. That is our general context. But in terms of the differences, richness and diversity and intersectionality, we can always bring that into conversation and discussion, and being mindful that there are certain communities that are also further marginalized because of those intersectional connections. And again, you know, I bring this up as well. You know, there is a lot of conversation about, you know, who is Black, who is African, who's not African, who's Caribbean. But again, I stress, you know, the second bullet point, the system sees us as Black communities, and the impact of anti-Black racism is common to all of us. But internally, when we are thinking about, it's very important also to consider those diversities and those intersectionalities, and that's how we balance the way we move forward. So there are several principles and values and you know, Afrocentric wisdom and knowledge that exist. I'm going to share a few here. Partly, this is the journey where TAIBU we started, and so I'm being mindful of that. But I don't want you to consider the next few slides as the, oh, okay, this is what Afrocentricity is. These are just examples and opportunities for us to look at this from a different perspective. And so there are so many values and principles that have been put out there from knowledge perspective, you know, the restoration of sovereignty focused on self-determination, And you can think of the Quilombo concept and the Quilombo communities, and in the Caribbean, maybe it's the Maroons. This is about their own self-determination, right? We can think about the Sankofa installation. These are some principles that we can think of that would help us to gauge ourselves and build our governance model and how we do things. And this is also key important for many of the work that we do. There is the Ma'at restoration from Egypt and the civilization in Egypt, and it's very difficult to actually define this Ma'at concept and philosophy and principle, but it incorporates these values and principles such as truth and justice and harmony and balance and reciprocity, and all these are principles that have existed in much before what we call civilization as defined by Europe, as Sante was saying earlier on. So these are the areas where we can really investigate and say, okay, what are some of the values that will be helpful for our organizations and the communities that we serve? What are we going to bring into the space? The Johari Sita installation is another, there are 6 steps and 6 elements of Afrocentric leadership or Black leadership based on the experiences of the Quilombo, as I said earlier on, in the Maroons, organizing African people to exercise control over production, distribution, and consumption. And the 6 elements are, food, clothing, shelter, education, healthcare, and self-defense, and incorporates not just activities and practices, but also transformation. And so those are the kind of things that we can think of when we're creating our board or when we are constituting our board for engagement and bringing about change. At TAIBU, we have started with the exploration and looking into the Kwanzaa principles, the 7 Kwanzaa principles, and to see how we can really begin to incorporate these values and principles in the way that we do. Just as a background information, when TAIBU was established in 2008, there was a lot of expectation, there was a lot of need that emerged, and we were also very excited. So we got to work immediately, and we were doing work on the ground and doing activities, engaging with people, doing needs assessment. And when we find out that there is a need, we would develop programs and for youth, for adults, for seniors. And then, we got to a stage where we were doing our second strategic planning refresh. And that provided us an opportunity to pause and to say, okay, we are mandated to serve the Black people. We're saying that we are using, this is an Afrocentric values and stuff. We see it, we experience it, but how do we know? How can we measure? How can we demonstrate that we're doing this, both from a governance perspective, but also from operational perspective? And that gives us a time to really think about that. And so what we started doing is we took the Kwanzaa principles as a starting point and developed some concepts around our organizational values and principles, and saying, okay, when we're thinking about cooperative economics, the principle of Wijama, we're talking about being accountable and efficient. As a Black organization, this is going to be very important, and we're going to use this as one of our guiding principles and values. Or when we're thinking about combined creativity, we will do, creating something innovative with good quality to make sure that we can measure change so that we create something better than the one community that we have received. Or when we're talking about self-determination or kujijagulia, it's going to be very important that our programs and services lead to self-determination. How are we measuring this, and how do we ensure that this is going to be part of the work that we do, including governance, right? How is the board's policies, the board's strategic directions, are they going to lead, towards self-determination? And how do we function also as an organization and as a board when we come to self-determination? Are we making sure that there's going to be some work around that? And so we did this kind of an exercise and looked at all these 7 principles of collective works and responsibility. Thinking about spiritualness and making sure that there's a whole person care that looks at health and social determinants of health from a physical, social, mental, spiritual component. And how do we do that from a governance and operational perspective? Also, the unity and bringing communities to solve communities' problems. I am who I am because of who you are. These are the kind of principles. The purpose of the organization, addressing racism, you may have seen it in the vision and mission of the organization, but making the purpose of the organization to address and eliminate systemic racism through the intersectionality of social determinant of health. And so based on that, we created our model of Black health and well-being that has 3 main goals of restoration, the prevention of ill health from the restoration of health and wellness, and the advancement of community well-being. It's not, from an African Center perspective, it's not just individual health that is important for us, but it's the community care and well-being that is going to be important for us. And you will see within those goals, we have identified, which guiding principles are the ones that are going to drive and be the focus of those goals. And the same thing with principles. What are those values that are going to drive us in making sure that we have an intersectional approach to what we do, to our Afrocentric, well-being and Black health, promoting quality. And then through practice, the social determinants of health is our purpose. The collaboration is about our unity, the accessibility, the collective works, and then the advancement of community well-being and governance, which is the self-determination. So this is how we have created this kind of both a governance, where the governance is focusing on and making sure that these values and conversations are happening in the right way and how it should be. And then also through how the organization is moving forward in addressing any community need that comes in. Right now, we are at a space where we're saying, okay, this feels good, this is good, it's good, it's a good start. Obviously, it's a living document. It's going to be, an ongoing improvement and work that we have to do. But we are saying, okay, if this is our model, how are we going to measure and evaluate and demonstrate that when we govern the organization with this model, when we do programs and services with this model, when we engage with other community organizations and do collaboration using this model, how are we going to measure to say, because of this model and the thinking and bringing Afrocentric values and principles and guiding, guidances, we are able to achieve X, Y, and Z, right? If a program was successful, was it successful because it was funded well? Was it successful because it was addressing emerging need? Or was it successful because the way the programs were planned, the way the communities were engaged, the way the program was implemented and delivered had components of our model and well-being and the Afrocentricity within that, and how did those contribute to the success of the program? And that is where we're working now, developing this evaluation framework with key Afrocentric indicators that would ask those questions and would be able to demonstrate at the end, because these principles were part of how we engaged, here is how successful we were, whether it is through engagement of the board, doing some collaboration. We talked about the board does 4 functions: it plans, it oversees, it engages, right? How are those inserted into the work that we do? This is the French version of the model. Just checking time. Okay. And there are other principles that we are also beginning to incorporate. For example, the principle of Ubuntu, which is a principle that says "I am because we are." It's from South Africa, and it is, you know, most of the time these kind of concepts are very difficult to clearly define them in the languages that we know of. But this is about humanness and coming together and saying, you know, your problem is my problem. I cannot be well if you're not well. And if I'm not well, the community is not well. And so using that kind of an approach helps to design strategies, priorities that is really about the community and not so much about each individual people. I don't know, maybe I will see if we have time to show. I think it's a short video. Maybe I can show this. Okay. Let me do the same thing as I did before. Stop sharing, and we can show this video, and then we'll take it from there. Oops, something is wrong, it says. In the meantime, if there are any questions, please shout out some questions while I'm trying to organize this second video. Are there any questions so far?
Liben, if you like, I have the video open. I can share it on the screen.
Oh, okay, thank you. That's very helpful. Any questions just before we screen the next video? Are there any thoughts? Am I making sense? Are there any comments that you may want to share? You know, it's always good to hear. If it was in a room, you could see where people are. When you're not in the room, it's very difficult to gauge where people are. So I just to see if there are some thoughts here, and then we can continue with the video. Okay, maybe it's a quiet group. All right, Adel, please. Thank you very much.
Ubuntu, in very broad terms, is an ethic of interdependence. It's an ethic that recognizes that everything that I do has an effect on you and your well-being, and everything that you do has an effect on me and my well-being. That we, although we are different people, we are essentially interconnected. And that is a truth that is not limited to Africa or South Africa. It's a truth that is universal. You know, we at this time were watching all kinds of horrors being perpetrated in the name of religion all over the world. And our anguish is shared with the anguish of families that look nothing like us, speak languages that we don't understand, live in ways that have no commonality with the ways in which we live. But the ethic of Ubuntu says, when a child is kidnapped, my heart hurts like the heart of the mother whose child has been stolen.
Thank you. So I think that gives us a little bit of an idea of what Ubuntu is. I'll just share an example of how at least we have implemented in terms of Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu, and a program around that maybe help to conceptualize how for me at least transformational it has been over the last few years. This is around engaging seniors, and when we started, in our early years, we really wanted to look for a program for seniors that moved away from just doing, the usual activities of bingo and gentle exercise and arts and crafts. These exist, and there are good spaces for seniors to come together and share time, but do all these activities. It's, there's nothing wrong with that. But for us, we really wanted to move a little bit further to say, when we look at our seniors in our Canadian context, many of the seniors have come from a tradition, an environment where they were comfortable with, where there are no social structures, there are no programs like this, and it's the village that takes care of the village. It's the neighbors that take care of the neighbor. And so we said, maybe we should start thinking about this. And that's where the concept of Ubuntu came. So as we were brainstorming and researching, we landed on this concept of Ubuntu, the principle of Ubuntu, the value of Ubuntu. And we said, maybe that's what we need to do. We need to create an environment, a virtual Ubuntu village here. We started it in Malvern. We said, maybe we should create a virtual Ubuntu village here in Malvern, where we get the seniors to come and they look after each other. They do what they need to do by themselves, for themselves, and for their well-being. And so we gathered, quite a few seniors, and we started having conversation with them. They were meeting on a regular basis, and we did some needs assessment. What from their perspective, what is needed for the seniors in our community, and then we also did an asset map to say, and what are the skills that are available within our seniors community. Usually programs are designed for seniors, right? And seniors are regarded as people who now, because of their age or retirement, they just need to be engaged, and we have to do something for them, right? For us, it was like, and what do you have to give? What do you have to contribute? What exists as your asset? Because a lot of the seniors, number one, I always say this, they possess the most valuable resource that we know of, which is time. A lot of the seniors have time. But two, the seniors have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge. Even if it's not work experience, they have a lot of life experience that they can bring as an asset to the work that they can do by themselves, for themselves. So we gathered this, and we did this 2 exercises of need assessment and asset mapping. And then we brought back what they have shared with us, thematized, and say, here is what you've told us. You've told us chronic disease is important for you. You've told us nutrition and food security is important for us. You told us that capacity building is important for us. And they identified about 7 themes, right? And then we organized, the seniors organized themselves around these themes to say, I have experience around this, or I have passion around this, and I want to work around this. And they started organizing themselves. Now we have what is called the Ubuntu Elder Council. They are responsible for all seniors programming in the north of Scarborough, and all planning is done by them. The groups, the different theme groups, the chronic disease, we still have art and craft. We still have a writers group. We have all those activities, but it's all done by the seniors, and it changes from year to year. So very recently, for example, the seniors were sitting in a lot of committee meetings, and they started to introduce, stretching exercises because they were sitting a lot. And then through that process, they said, oh, you know what, exercise is going to be very important. So a few of the seniors who were interested in physical activity identified that they wanted to be trained. So now we have about eight or so seniors who are trained facilitators in gentle seniors exercise. They went through a program, they did a placement, and now are certified to lead physical activities for the seniors themselves. So we have built this capacity of Ubuntu and saying, your problem is my problem. I'm going to be part of this village. And so that principle brings the organic movement of people's participation and engagement. And they feel that this is truly about them. It's not an organization doing something for them. And so I just wanted to share this just to demonstrate that when values that are internal and intrinsic to communities, how they have viewed themselves, where their roots and identity are, how they do things, how knowledge is passed on. Things come together and it becomes organic. It makes sense, right? So this is the kind of things that we have been doing, and now introducing this to different programs. How can we do this with the youth? How can we do this with young girls, and bringing this concept and what we're learning into the different organizational capacity and service delivery as well. And today, at least, and we are now expanding this model to the south of Scarborough and to the west of Toronto as well. And we were wanting to kind of scale up and expand in other areas as well. And hopefully, with collaboration, the right resources, we really want to take this up, because we believe this truly demonstrates what an Afrocentric valued and principled movement can create. So today we have about 200 seniors who are engaged in various activities. About 30 programs happen in the week where it's all facilitated by seniors. You will be amazed how they pivoted into online continuation of service during COVID without us knowing. And by the time we figured our own organizational kind of, management of going online and you doing all our care and services, when we go to the senior, they said, we're already doing it. We're already online. Our meetings did not stop. We have continued our work. They ran a food bank. They started a food bank, and this is all led by the seniors. They have a weekly healthy hot meals provided to about 250 to 300 people in the community. They have published 2 books. They have created a computer literacy curriculum that our local library has really wants to adopt now. So it has been very organic. So when people connect to the principles that they know of and feel comfortable and trust with, things can happen magically. And so that's why the Afrocentricity, the concept of Afrocentric values and principles, and bringing from the margin to the center makes sense. And so when we do our governance of organization, when we are looking at how we model ourselves, these are going to be very, very important. And maybe what I will do is there is one more video around African leadership that I would like to show. And then maybe we can pause, have some conversation. I'm seeing some chat comments and questions there. We can also entertain those. But I think if we are understanding what if we're understanding if we're understanding what the concept of Afrocentricity is, and I will also touch upon next week when we talk about this, but these are just some principles, and there are some principles maybe from your community's perspective. There are some traditions, there are some rituals, there are some principles and values that would make sense for your organization. And I think it would be good to have that conversation and identify those, and then bringing in and saying, okay, maybe we will adopt those. And I think next week, probably what we would do is, maybe I'll talk about it after the video. But I'm just saying, do not just say, oh, okay, I don't relate to this principle because from where I come from, these values and principles do not make sense. maybe there are some other particular values and principles for the communities and that you serve come from. It starts with the conversation with people to say, what values do we have from, you know, the tradition of Sankofa, and saying what traditions and important roots and strength that we can bring from our roots and identity that we can bring for today to help us move towards tomorrow would be an interesting conversation to have. But let me share this video, and then we can get to having some conversations.
What is African Canadian leadership?
Oopsie. What happened?
Liben, if you like, I also have this video.
Oh, you have it ready?
Yes.
Okay. You're such a great support, Adil. Thank you very much.
Canadian leadership? Well, it's a broad series of practices that people are engaged in their communities to make their communities better, to make their families better, to enhance the quality of experience for their children. But also it's about contributing to the broader community to ensure that Canada meets its ideals and fulfills its images of itself. Typically, we associate leadership with individuals who are the leaders of organizations or in positions of authority in government or some other organization. But we're saying, yeah, that's one type, but then there are so many other types. Leadership is lateral. Very often it comes from below upward. One of the things that Martin Luther King said was that he would not be in his position of advocacy were it not for people pushing and advancing him to take on that position. The struggle for making change in the lives of African Canadian people in concrete ways to better the quality of education, to ensure that there is less or reduced racism in policing, the criminal legal system, that there is fair access to employment, that there is equality of condition, not simply opportunity. This is really about the ways that different types of people in leadership positions, be it from the community or in particular organizations, that they work with institutions and bureaucracies to create policies for change. The issue is that the process of making policy always involves negotiation. So what we need to be mindful of is that in the process of negotiation that we don't water down what it is that we want more to be concretely real. And this is a struggle for anyone engaged in leadership in any position on behalf of any community or movement. And it's no different for African Canadians, that there aren't concessions made in such a way as to undermine the real thrust and the value of what people really want to see in terms of changing their lives. Strong Black leadership is not only about Black people, but it's about Black people as the embodiment of the expression of the full range of our humanity, which is the struggle for all of us.
So I'm gonna pause here and connect, take questions, comments, reflections, challenges, addition to the conversation. Really, this is a time for us to do that. And then what I would like to do, and maybe if some of your questions, because I think what we can do next week at the next session would be to really have a conversation, practical conversation, not that we have a concept and a model that we've tried and I shared with you today. Maybe there could be some practical questions that we can think of, but even if there are any other comments and questions today, but I would like to do some practical things. People would bring certain situations and saying, you know what, here is what we're trying to do, and how then can we do, how does this Afrocentric governance look like if we were to do X, Y, and Z? That would be a good conversation to have, I think, as a learning for all of us, including myself, because there may be some great things that are happening with you as well. I know people are watching other people, but it's okay to be the first one to ask. Does that mean it did not make sense at all? Okay, thank you. Some questions in the chat, so that's encouraging. What would be some key takeaways advice you would give to Black organization trying to use Afrocentricity? I think from TAIBU's perspective, my personal view perspective, I think number one, based on the first few conversations that we had, the first few slides that we had, where we find ourselves located in our social and political environment, both as individuals, right? It's always challenging for small grassroots community, Black-led community organizations to do work and separate themselves from the work, right? The work that we do is we are the work, and the work is also done by us. So from that context, I think Afrocentricity is going to be very important. However, the scope and the extent for you to adopt. But I think having that mindset and framework, both from an organizational perspective, from a strategic planning perspective, from priorities perspective, and how you define programs and stuff is going to be important. As you all know, just doing a program and reaching out and recruiting Black people does not answer the question we're trying to answer or address the issue that we want to address, right? And so we have to find a way that really is innovative in its sense that it connects to who we are as people of African descent, especially for new immigrants and refugees. It's going to be very critical because the clients that we're going to be serving are coming and they are already, in a challenging situation where their identity and their culture is being challenged, where they are pushed to assimilate, right, and pull towards integration, where they are playing those among very complex social health, education, employment structures that they have to navigate. And so from me, it's very, very important for the work that this sector does, that the concept of Afrocentricity is going to be at the center. So with that said, it's starting the conversation and identifying what are some cultures and norms that we know of from our communities. If it is based on, for example, a nation or a country, right? If I'm from this country and these are my values and principles that exist traditionally, historically, how can I bring them in the work that we do? I think that's going to be very important in order to serve the communities that we serve, to build from where they are and their identity. But two, it also helps us to come together when we are doing governance. As we know, governance is important, it's critical. It has also its own challenges. And so, if you remember some of the circles of conflicts that we said when we're working in a board happens, sometimes the conflict is about values and interest of the organization. And this is how the values, the Afrocentric values, would bring us together to work well in good conditions, but also solve problems when we have conflict and challenges that we face, right? Just like in our cultures and traditions, when there are community issues to be resolved, we gather together, we involve elders. In some spaces, it's under the boab tree or a big tree in the village, right? In French, the idea of arbre à palabre, which is the same thing as Ubuntu, is like you come together to resolve a community situation, a board situation. Those kind of principles and guidance, and even if they are identified as a policy, gives us an opportunity to say, this is how we work, and this is why we are here together. So those are very critical, I think. And that's why like we are, we're very, very keen in kind of having this conversation. There's another question. There's quite a few questions now, which is great. Is it possible for us to, okay, that's on a personal level, definitely. People, I'm going to put my email out there and we can do that. But I also want to use next week's session for some of your questions to come with your questions, because what would be helpful is, individually working together, that would be great. But I think there is, again, from an Afrocentric principle value, there's going to be a common shared learning for all of us when we bring our questions to find solutions for ourselves. So as much as I'm happy and I commit to supporting people with these ideas, let's bring some of those technical questions that we want to talk together next week. Yeah, so it takes care of especially youth involving drugs and dropouts from academy. That's also a very good question I received here. Very, very briefly, why are our youth really impacted by these health and social challenges? Especially nowadays within our Black youth and particularly newcomer youth, we're seeing a significant challenge around mental health and addiction issues are becoming a very serious trend, as we are seeing. And it's because of how the system is holding up our youth, and how the system is not supporting parents to hold our youth together. There's a huge cultural differences that is happening, and we see there is a role reversal within the home. The children are, very, very quick to adapt to the new culture and stuff like that. And parents and caregivers are slow to adjust to that. And so we see that the challenge is now sometimes the youth becoming the parents and the parents becoming the youth, because control shifts from, knowledge, language, all these things that help you to access certain things. If you don't have those, who holds those will be the one who will hold the power and control. And so understanding from that kind of an impact of anti-Black racism and cultural differences here. And so now if we do our engagement with our communities using these African-centered values, I think what it will do, at least at the minimum, is instill a sense of identity, a strong self of identity among the youth that would then act as a preventative factor when they are exposed to certain situations, whether it is peer pressure or addiction and other issues and mental health issues. So both from a planning perspective, from an organization, and many of you may be working boards right now, but doing that kind of an exercise and bringing that into the forefront would be something that would be helpful, and education as well, right? The dropouts rate is very high within the Black community, as we know. And okay, there are some people who are very interested, but here it is. I will only commit to work with you guys if you're going to bring some practical questions for us to talk about and get some learning. It's also be very good for me to be challenged with some difficult questions so that we can learn and grow together. But that would be my answer to those questions. I'm committing myself to support people, but we have to have a very engaged conversation next week to be able to do that, to really bring this, to the center, as I started by saying, to bring our knowledge, culture, norms, experiences to the center, so that we're not spectators, but agents of change for our communities. I will stop there because I see the time is about to run out. So I'll pass it on to Adel. Thank you.
Thank you, Liben. I just want to echo on what you've already mentioned. Just going to share the screen for a moment. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's session. Our follow-up question and answer session, where we talk more, as Liben have mentioned. It will be a discussion. Please come with your questions and your thoughts and your suggestions. The follow-up session will be on February 15, next Thursday, from 12 to 1 EST time. And big thank you to Liben. You've been our trainer for the last two workshops, Governance 101 and Afrocentric Governance. And I would also like to thank our interpreters who joined us today, our ASL, LSQ, caption writer, and simultaneous French interpreters. And a thank you to our OCASI staff who are with us today, supporting with the technicalities in the background. And finally, a big thank you for you, the participants, for whether this is the first time attending a workshop as part of this series, or you've been with us since November 9, that's when this series has started on a weekly basis. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.